What's up, folks? What's going on? Welcome to the Spun Today podcast, the only podcast that is anchored in writing, but unlimited in scope. I'm your host, Tony Ortiz, and I appreciate you listening. This is episode 277. It is the first episode of 2025 and is the official 2024 Spun Today wrap-up show. In this episode, I'm going to reflect on the top 5 Spun Today episodes of 2024 in terms of listenership, and I also share some of my writing and podcasting goals for 2025, as well as look back on the goals that I set last year for 2024, so I can beat myself up a little bit on all the shit that I did not achieve. Stick around for all that good stuff, but first, I wanted to share a quick way that you can help support this podcast if you so choose. Your support means a ton. It's very motivating, much appreciated. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can help support, not just financially if you want to go that route, but by rating and reviewing either my books or my podcast. And there's a bunch of different shopping discounts that you get, maybe for something that you're already looking for. And I benefit from that by you using my affiliate links. All this can be found on my website, spuntoday.com/support. That's where you'll find all my merch, all the links to discount codes, my affiliate links, donation links, so on and so forth. But here is just one of those ways you can help support, and then we'll jump right into the show. The Spun Today newsletter is available to each and every one of my listeners absolutely for free. All you have to do is go to spuntoday.com/subscribe and drop in your email address. What I'm going to do is brighten up everybody's least favorite day of the week by delivering 5 curated things within my weekly newsletter every Monday at noon. You're going to receive a photo of the week, a recommended podcast of the week. I listen to tons of podcasts from an array of varied interests. I cherry pick the very best ones so that you can check them out. I also share a video of the week, which can be anything from a tasty recipe to a dope rap battle to an enlightening TED Talk. I also share a quote of the week. And finally, for my fellow wordsmiths out there, a word of the week, so that you can step up your vocab. Again, this curated list is yours absolutely free by going to spuntoday.com/subscribe and dropping in your email address, and you can unsubscribe at any time. Again, go to spuntoday.com/subscribe, drop in your email address, and you'll get the very next one. And now let's recap the top 5 most listened to episodes of the Spun Today podcast in 2024. Starting off at the 5th spot is episode 255, Jose De La Rosa, Golden Gloves champ, firefighter, and fitness aficionado. Shout out to Jose and this episode, which was a bit of a surprise for me because it was a re-released episode. This year's actual top 5 has a few surprises in it, but it's a re-release episode, an episode that I initially released the prior year, I want to say, 2023, or maybe even 2022 when we released the original. But sometimes on either around the holidays or for whatever reason, I can't record a brand new episode. What I'll do is kind of like remaster and re-release a prior released episode, or if it's fitting for whatever reason, like I do yearly, for example, with the 9/11 episode that I recorded, where I interviewed close friends and family, all of which were around and affected here in New York during 9/11. I release that every year, but it's one of those like re-release episodes, so I wouldn't expect it to have garnered so much listenership, but super happy that it did. Shout out again to Jose, and it's a dope episode. You guys should definitely go back and listen if you haven't. Jose is a friend of mine from junior high and high school that we went to together. He went off to become a Golden Gloves champion. He also won the Silver Gloves. For those who don't know, it's a prestigious boxing title to achieve. He's also a New York City firefighter, and he's super into fitness. He's always posting like videos on his workouts and recommended workouts. And ever since that episode, we're always saying we're going to link up again to do another episode, because they had like so much more to the story to speak on, and it was just a great episode. So definitely one of the goals I want to circle back to later this year. And I'll link to Jose's page in the episode notes so you guys can go check him out as well. The fourth most listened episode of the Spun Today podcast in 2024 was episode 253 of the Spun Today podcast. Yet another surprise on the list. It was technically not a re-release, although some of the content is, but I was actually very happy to see this on the list because episode number 253 is the Goats Doing Goat Shit mashup, number 1. So there's a segment that I started doing, I want to say a year, maybe even like a year and a half, 2 years ago. But it's where I wanted to highlight folks that are GOATs within their respective fields, greatest of all time, that go above and beyond in a certain way that they didn't have to. And I want to give that type of mentality and action, I want to give that in and of itself its flowers. Just people doing dope shit, whether morally or in some sort of financial space, that I think deserves much more attention. So I created this segment called Goats Doing Goat Shit for that purpose. And what episode 253 is, because I usually have like a goat per episode, well, I want to make it per episode, which is another, again, 2025 goal. But I usually have one goat mentioned during an episode. Not necessarily every single episode. It could be every, other or every 2 or 3 episodes. But what I did was create this episode 253, which is a mashup of a bunch of different D's, if you will, into the Spun Today Goats Doing Goat Shit list. So if you've missed any of the prior episodes and you're interested in just this type of content, you can obviously listen to this episode, which is a mashup of a bunch of them, not all of them, but a bunch of them, which included in this episode, Conor, just to give you guys an idea of what it is, but Conor McGregor, who's, double UFC champ, UFC superstar, he went off to do a great spirits deal with his whiskey Proper 12 and wound up doubling his net worth in the process, which was already impressive after he made something like $100 million or something like that after fighting Floyd Mayweather in a crossover boxing match. So really impressive financial move. So I added him to the list. I also broke down Joe Rogan versus Carlos Mencia. So this is when Joe went out of his way to stand up to Carlos Mencia, which was a bigger act at the time, because Carlos was stealing jokes allegedly from fellow comedians that were within Rogan's orbit, like some of his boys, but lower on the totem pole in terms of stand-up comedy. So Carlos would just get away with it because he was such a big name and a big act, and they were scared to speak up for themselves. So Rogan took it upon himself to stand up to Carlos in a very public fashion in the middle of a comedy club on stage, and the rest is history. I also added Rory and Mal's in this episode. Rory and Mal's initial Stitcher deal, which has since run its course. It was a licensing deal, and now they have a new licensing deal, which is why I always harp on, maybe one day, knock on wood, I'll be in a position to do so, but just even like with your writing, with podcasting, with music, with any creative work, shoot for owning your IP, because folks, might get wide-eyed and take the short bag, take the short money, and just, sell something that they created, give all the rights away, essentially, because they say, here's $1 million. But if you want to keep your IP, then it's $50,000 or $100,000 or something like that. Take the $100,000, take the $50,000, because what you can do, instead of taking the $1 million or whatever it is, hypothetical numbers, obviously, but similar to how Rory and Mal did, they got their money from the Stitcher deal. It was a licensing deal. They still own their podcast and their IP, their intellectual property. And now they're in another licensing deal. So they resold it again. And as long as you keep the ownership of what you create, you can keep doing that forever, in perpetuity. Alternatively, you sell it for the $1 million, and then that company that buys that IP from you, they're going to do that. They're going to keep selling it in perpetuity and make the money off of you forever. So I wanted to shout them out for that deal. I also added Issa Rae for her Issa Rae Warner Media deal. Great, incredible content creator. Not even content creator. She's a showrunner, fucking movie star, writer. I've taken her masterclass, which was great. Created the HBO big series, Insecure, which was spawned from her awkward black girl YouTube series that she was creating herself, creating, directing, and acting in herself. That led to the Insecure HBO deal, which ultimately led to this Issa Rae Warner Media deal for multiple millions. And I think, if I remember correctly, I shouted her out specifically for, there was like some sort of like 10 or 20, 15 or $20 million offer that they offered her for the deal, which she turned down. And most folks were like, what? Are you fucking crazy? How do you turn down $20 million? And from her perspective, essentially, she was like, because I know my worth. I know what I have to sell is not worth 20. It's worth a lot more. You know, from the outside looking in, it's like 20 million. Take that. But again, sticking to your guns, knowing what it is that you're selling, owning your IP. And she wound up getting, you know, multiple times that when they came back around. So shout out to Issa Rae. And in this episode, 2 more goats doing goat shit segments that I mashed together here. Second to last being the Kobe body armor deal. RIP to the GOAT, Kobe Bryant, who invested in a company called Body Armor, which is a competitor or within the same space, smaller market share, but within the same space of Gatorade. You know, one of these sports drink beverages. And he invested $6 million into the company when they were in its infancy, in very nascent stages, for a 10% stake in the company. Coca-Cola wound up acquiring that company, and that 10% stake turned into a $400 million payout for Kobe and his family. Now his family. So $6 million investment, saw the opportunity there with just a lion's share of the market that Gatorade owned. So a competing company had a very small percentage of that market share. He invested in that company because thought it was a wise investment to do so, I would imagine. And, you know, good tasting beverages, you know, very similar stuff. And they had a chance to be acquired by a company that wanted to either buy them, for example, so that they can own even more of the market share. If it's the same company that if Coca-Cola owns Gatorade, I'm not sure, or if it's Pepsi, maybe, like those parent companies, they're just like conglomerates and own everything. But it's a smart play because it could go one of two ways. Either that same company will buy you so that, you know, they can own even more of the market and just sell you 2 seemingly different things, you know, Gatorade, Powerade, Body Armor. And meanwhile, the same company owns it and it's just making money and you think you're buying different things. Or an actual competing company will buy them out to gain market share against Gatorade. And essentially, either which way it went, that $6 million investment turned into $400 million. Again, shout out to Kobe the GOAT and RIP. And last but certainly not least, the last goats doing goat shit that I added to this specific mashup episode was the YMH Stitcher deal. YMH, for those who don't know, is Your Mom's House. It's become a podcast network. It's initially a podcast, soul podcast, by hosts the hilarious Tom Segura, stand-up comic, and the hilarious Christina Pazitsky, his wife. They have a podcast together. They're both stand-up comics, and super popular. They innovated within the field, doing like pay-per-view style podcasts for certain events. Have a pretty popular cult following. Got this Stitcher deal. I think it was like a $10 or $15 million deal for their podcast, and you know, started putting out other podcasts under their YMH umbrella. Like Ari Shafir's new You Be Trippin' podcast is under there. Danny Brown's podcast is on there. Two Bears, One Cave, which is Tom and Bird's podcast, is on there. So on and so forth. So that was a pretty dope deal. Pretty cool to see, especially if you know them and follow them from, you know, early on in their careers. When famously, for example, Tom Segura didn't even know what a podcast was. He's one of these comics in like Rogan's orbit. When Rogan was first starting his podcast, and he would go on there and be like, what is this? Who's listening to this? How does this? What? And then, you know, fast forward to him having his own podcast network, including his flagship show, and garnering, you know, tens of millions of dollars in the process. The number 3 most listened to episode of the Spun Today podcast in 2024 was episode 250, titled Mastering the Myth. Navigating Imposter Syndrome and Cultivating Creative Currency. This was a free writing session episode. For those of you who don't know, one of the types of episodes that I do on this podcast, which are honestly one of my favorite types to do, because it's very, very writing centric. You know, this is, after all, a mainly writing podcast, right? Like I touch on, you know, current events and topical things, and, you know, just break down like movies and TV shows, but I always try to do it from the lens of a writer or an aspiring writer, if you will. But these free writing session episodes specifically are a lot more in the weeds of writing. So it's more like writing inside baseball, and they're some of my favorites to do. And in this episode specifically, and the general format of it is that I share a writing tip for fellow writers out there. Usually one. In this episode, I actually shared two, one from Kevin Smith and another one from K.M. Weiland. And just like great anecdotal little, you know, pieces of advice related to writing and just like creative motivation in general that I want to share and put out there. I also share my writing stats, you know, let you guys know how much I've been writing over the past, you know, month or two. That's more so for, you know, just keeping myself honest, for my tracking purposes, so that I can see, you know, I have a goal of X, for example, to like write a book by the end of the year. But then I can reflect on these specific writing stats and see, you know, instead of wondering at the end of the year, oh man, why didn't I write the book? I could look at these writing stats and be like, oh, okay, that's why I wrote, you know, 10% of the days in April. I wrote, you know, 15% of the days of March, so on and so forth. With the low numbers like that, obviously it's not going to yield good results. So it's kind of like a way for me to like track and try to motivate myself to write more. So I share those writing stats. I share what I've been reading, and I break down a book, for example, once I finish it, and I share my favorite takeaways from that book. In these episodes, this one specifically, I shared The Daily Dad by Ryan Holiday. And I tell you guys a little bit of what that's about. And I also shared in this episode, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. And last but not least, what I do in these free writing session episodes is I share a piece of my own writing, usually a piece of free writing, which is a practice that I like to do often. And, you know, it could be something that I wrote, you know, 3, 4, 5, 8 years ago, just a paragraph or two on anything. And I just share it with you guys. I reflect on it myself. And yeah, that's pretty much the format for these free writing session episodes. And that one was episode 256, which again was the third most listened to episode of 2024. The second most listened to episode of the Spun Today podcast in 2024. This one was definitely a surprise for me because it was the 2023 Spun Today wrap-up show. So this specific show that I'm doing right now, which is the wrap-up of 2024, the 2023 wrap-up show was the second most listened to episode of 2024, which surprising, I guess, but yeah, it was surprising to me. But yeah, thank you folks for listening. And last but certainly not least, the number one most listened to episode of the Spun Today podcast in all of 2024 was, just pretend you're hearing a drum roll right now, episode 254 of the Spun Today podcast, which was Black Mirror, the Jack Ryan finale, American Fiction, and Joe Rogan's renewed Spotify deal. Shout out to the number one episode. This was one of those pretty like self-explanatory episodes in terms of, if you're following the title, I broke down watching recent season of Black Mirror, which was season 6 of Black Mirror. Great TV show on Netflix, super creative. Each episode is like its own little movie. Very, very, very much so. Recommend it. I tell you guys who the writers are. I share the official synopsis. I break down certain episodes. I tell you guys what my favorite parts of each episode were. And they definitely do have spoilers when I do these little breakdowns, so beware if you don't want to hear any. I also spoke about the Jack Ryan final season, the series finale, where again, it's a TV show. It's on Amazon. I like bumped into the show on accident, watched one episode years ago, and just got completely roped in. It's a great action, Mission Impossible type of series. John Krasinski, who plays Jim from The Office, is the lead in this dramatic series, which was like interesting juxtaposition from what we're used to seeing him acting in, or at least me. And he knocked it out of the fucking park. He plays Jack Ryan, which is like a CIA, like smart desk guy, but he has this like military background of being just a fucking badass on the field also, but nobody like really knows about it. And he chases down terrorists, and it's a dope series. And the final season, which is what I break down in this episode, definitely did not disappoint. Then I also broke down American Fiction, the movie, which was amazing, starring Jeffrey Wright, Tracy Ellis Ross, John Ortiz, Issa Rae is in it, which I mentioned earlier, Erica Alexander. It was a great movie that I definitely highly recommend folks watching. I broke that down in this episode. And the last thing I spoke about in that episode was another addition to the Goats Doing Goat Shit segment. And in this instance, it was Joe Rogan's second Spotify deal. After his first, again, going back to the whole licensing deal concept, instead of him like selling his podcast rights to some company for $100 million, which folks would have probably done, he licensed it specifically for 3 years for that $100 million. If somebody wanted to buy it outright, maybe they would have offered him, like 2 or 3. But he took $100 million, and it was just for 3 years. Then everything goes back to normal. He keeps his $100 million. He owns his podcast, has continued doing it throughout. And at the end of the 100 years, it was such a lucrative deal from like a stock share price vantage point for Spotify that they wound up his licensing deal for more than double what they gave him the first time. So the second time around, it was $250 million. And he was also allowed to go wide, which meaning that not just exclusively to Spotify like the first deal was for the first 3 years. Now you can listen to JRE on every single platform. And because of that deal, again, where I like to highlight goats that do goat shit, I added Mr. Rogan to the list once again. And that, folks, was the number one most listened to episode of 2024, episode 254. Thanks again to each and every one of you who take the time to listen. It is much, much, much appreciated. So now let's reflect on goals. When I do these year-end wrap-ups, I like to reflect on the goals that I set for myself in the prior year. So in this case, 2024. Analyze if achieved or not, and then also establish my goals for 2025 moving forward, so that when I do the 2025 recap next year, I can kind of follow suit and, reflect and take inventory, if you will, on what was achieved, what wasn't achieved. And these are, like high level goals for the year, right? So I'm going to do that for both my writing goals and my podcasting goals, which are obviously intertwined in a sense. But let's start off with the writing. So in 2024, I set out 2 specific writing goals for myself for the year. I toned it down a notch from 2023, if I remember correctly, where I had just a shitload of goals, unrealistic. So I scaled it back in an effort to not overwhelm myself in terms of the specific writing goals, but also, to have something more manageable, more doable. Now, if you're a listener to the pod, you know that this year went through a very tough time from a family perspective with my wife battling breast cancer. And, that obviously took a toll and warranted much more attention on that and her and getting through that period. And I actually did an episode with her for the podcast all about it, just to spread awareness on the topic and just to share her story on what she went through. And I say that not as an excuse, but just because I don't, how do I say it? I'm a firm believer that everybody's dealing with their own shit, and everybody gets the same amount of time. Everybody gets 24 hours in a day, regardless of who you are. So it's not an excuse, but I did want to highlight that a lot of time was obviously the majority, rightfully so, time was spent in dealing with that situation. So circling back to the goals that I actually set for myself in the beginning of the year, was to submit a draft of Fractal 2 for editing, and or at least finish the first draft of Fractal 2. Fractal, for those who may not know, is my novel. It's my science fiction time travel novel available now. The book 1 is. All the links you can find at spuntoday.com/books. Or search on Amazon or wherever it is that you get your books. And this is a deeper series. That's the first novel that I published a few years back. And my goal was to finalize at least the first draft of the second in the series. That goal was not achieved. I did work on it a bit more. Definitely not anything, not in any amount that I'm proud of. Feel like I could have done more, but definitely considering that goal a failure. The second goal, which I thought, the second and last goal actually that I established for myself for 2024 was to record the audiobook of my short story series that I did publish last year, Melted Cold. That book also available, spuntoday.com/books/melted cold. You find all the links of where you can purchase there. And I definitely thought I was going to have more time to focus on that or to achieve that. I felt it was less of a heavy lift for whatever reason, but also a failure and not an achieved goal. Now, looking forward to 2025, I'm definitely carrying both of those goals forward to achieve them for 2025, but actually adding this year a couple more, kind of as like a bit of a catch up for myself. First and foremost, consistency. Just like an overall foundational stick to a writing schedule, consistency. I've done that in spurts throughout my writing quote unquote career. Obviously, I've yielded much more results when I have stuck to a schedule. A lot of it since has been just more sporadic whenever I can find time, juggling family and kids and work and, just life in general. When you leave it up to just like write whenever it is that you think you have some free time, you wind up not doing it. So definitely want to firm up and stick to a consistent schedule. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2 would be recording the audiobook for Melted Cold, my short story series. Goal number 3 would be finishing the first draft of Fractal 2. That's a working title, by the way. As well as submitting both Fractal 1 and Fractal 2 for editing. Because what I want to do is re-release the first book in the series after getting it professionally edited, the way I did with my short story series, Melted Cold, and re-put it out when I re-put out Fractal 2. So that's kind of like a dual goal there within that Fractal series. And last but not least, revisit and finish writing and publishing Make Way for You in Espanol. Make Way for You is the first book that I ever wrote. It's a nonfiction. I call it The Poor Man's War of Art by Steven Pressfield. And I've written probably around 30 or 40%. I've translated myself into Spanish. And I would like to finish that off to put that out. Something that I started doing, I dropped. I started doing it close to like right after publishing it, honestly. And just like dropped it, never picked it back up. Or that's a lie. I picked it up here and there, translated a passage or two, just haven't followed through with finishing it. So that would be the fourth and final goal I'm setting for myself from a writing perspective for 2025. So in 2024, now speaking to podcast goals, my podcast goals for 2024, I set an overall arching goal to increase my listenership by 50%. And that was definitely not achieved. It actually dropped year over year, specific downloads just from podcatchers itself by 64%. That deserves another. And overall, a year over year drop, factoring in just complete views like with shorts and clip videos and stuff like that, which I did successfully track this year, which was a sub goal, which I'll get to. That dropped as well by about 57%. So yeah, a lot of womps there. So definitely failed on that goal, which again, I attributed to just trying to be objective to, not being as consistent as I have been in, the last 9 years prior with releasing episodes every other Thursday on the dot. I started slipping with that towards like the latter half of last year. And there were a lot more re-release episodes this past year as well, just because, time constraints with being able to record and edit, so on and so forth. So I'm not terribly surprised by the drop in in listenership there. Now, I also wanted to set a goal for myself last year to track year over year, and not just the downloads, which is what I was doing for many years, but also the YouTube videos as well as the shorts, and having a total across the board year over year grand total, which I did do successfully. So kind of achieved that sub goal. I also set a goal for myself of being more creative with posts and more consistent with posting podcast clips and posts on Instagram, Twitter, etc. And I wanted to also start posting on LinkedIn and TikTok just to like expand the base there a bit. And I successfully did so. So I started leveraging this tool called Author Social Assistant, which was great for, and I recommend, I think I actually have an affiliate link in my support page that you guys can check out for, fellow writers or creatives out there that may be interested. It gives you like posts, like little like mini reels and just like memes, and the opportunity to like add your book to some stock imaging that looks really good and professional. And it gives you like a sample blurb to add as well, literally for like each day of a month. And you can add your branding to it. So I have like the Spun Today logo on them, and you could choose to remove it. For ones that you want to remove it from, you can, customize the text obviously and edit it how you want. So it's like a great starting template. And I've been using that, and it's, really helped increase like engagement on like IG and Twitter and stuff like that for those specific posts. And I've honed in on specific and consistent clip formats for the podcast, just visually in the way it looks. And that's all been going well. I've been pretty consistent with that. So I'll definitely consider that an achieved goal, minus the TikTok thing, which, by the way, banned me. I have no idea why. I just like joined just to start adding like podcast clips and stuff like that, and try to reach out, and it's like, a black box, never get anything back. I also set a goal for myself in 2024 to start customizing clips for the platform that they're going on, which that I haven't done, and kind of like don't consider that a goal that I'm going to be attempting or implementing moving forward, because for example, what's it called, like the 9x16, like the story style clips, that when I implement them on like YouTube or LinkedIn and Twitter, get like not exactly like widescreen, for example, on YouTube, but it does like some visual formatting where it gives it like a widescreen background based on like the standard square or vertical post that you put on, and that's working fine for me, I believe. So it's like the cost benefit of the time it would take to do like separate individuals. It just isn't there. I also gave myself a possible goal of increasing the output of the podcast to weekly from bi-weekly. That I said then was not feasible, and definitely still is not feasible moving forward. And I also had a goal in 2024, the last goal I set for myself for the podcast, to do at least 3+ interviews, separate interview episodes for the podcast, which I also did not achieve. I just did the one that I referenced earlier with my wife, Zoila, speaking about her battles with the breast cancer. So that is also another not achieved goal. Moving forward, and to establish the goals for 2025, I want to, again, similar to the writing, return to a consistent every other Thursday release, which would imply a return to a consistent every other week strict recording time for the pod, so then I can hit those Thursday releases. I also want to drastically reduce the re-release of episodes. I'm not going to say I'm not going to re-release any episodes, because life will be life, but definitely don't want to rely on any just due to like laziness or like anything like that. In terms of listenership, I want to increase it, obviously a millionfold, but given the trajectory of the past 2 years of slipping listenership, I think if I continue focusing on the quality, which I normally do for anything I put out, but hone in on the consistency and continue on the like exposure and like posting of episodes, which I also really like slacked on. Not gonna like the self-promotion side specific to the podcast, but the goal is, once honing in on that stuff, to increase listenership by at least 25% year over year. And the last goal for 2025 related to the podcast is to continue and stay consistent with the social posts. how I have been doing on the writing side, but to establish that consistency again with the shorts, posts on YouTube, which really slipped this year, and just more video clips as well, or video style clips of the podcast episodes as well. And that, folks, was episode 277 of the Spun Today podcast, the 2024 Spun Today wrap-up show. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you have any tips, advice, things that I can implement on my end that you would like to hear as a listener, or if you're a fellow podcaster or a writer, things that you think may help me implement the goals and achieve the goals that I want to achieve by the time I do the next Spun Today wrap-up show. And with that, folks, keep your head up, looking up to a prosperous and healthy 2025. Wishing you and yours the same. I'll check you guys out next time. Peace. What's up, folks? Tony here. I hope you're enjoying the Spun Today podcast as much as I enjoy producing it for you. Here are a few ways you can help support the show. You can support the Spun Today podcast financially by going to spuntoday.com/support. There you will find a couple different ways that you can do just that, some of which will actually not even cost you a dime, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. When you go to spuntoday.com/support, you'll see my affiliate link to Amazon. Click on it and it will take you to Amazon's website, where you can do your shopping like normal. This will not cost you anything extra, but Amazon will pay me for driving traffic to their website. If you'd like to support the podcast more directly, you can do so by becoming a patron. At spuntoday.com/support, you'll also find my Patreon link. This is where creators such as myself can be paid directly by patrons like you. You can either make a one-time donation or schedule recurring donations if you so choose. There are also different tiers of support, and depending on which you decide to go with, you'll also receive some perks in return, such as early access to content, free digital copies of my books, free bookmarks, etc. That is, again, by supporting via my Patreon link, available at spuntoday.com/support. Similar to Patreon, at that same location, you'll also find my Ko-fi link as well as my Buy Me a Coffee link. They work very similar to Patreon and are different ways that you can help support the show financially. And last but certainly not least, you have the good old-fashioned PayPal donation button. Any which way that you choose to support is greatly appreciated. It all helps me do more of what I love, which is writing and podcasting. Again, go to spuntoday.com/support. You can also support the Spun Today podcast by rating and reviewing the show wherever it is that you're listening to this episode. I'd really appreciate it because it really does help. Also, follow me on all socials. At Spun Today on X, formerly known as Twitter. At Spun Today on Instagram. And at Spun Today on YouTube, where you'll not only find full-length episodes of the podcast, but also chopped up clips and additional content. And of course, you can follow the Facebook page at facebook.com/Spun Today. Another way you can help support the Spun Today podcast and also upgrade that stale wardrobe of yours is by going to spuntoday.com/support and clicking on the banner for Stitch Fix. Once you do, you'll enjoy a $25 discount to your first purchase. And the way Stitch Fix works is pretty cool. I use it and I've never been disappointed. You'll set up a profile, you'll put in all the sizes for your clothes, as well as all the different brands and types of clothes that you like to wear. It's really simple and intuitive to set up. They'll show you pictures and pretty much give you a thumbs up or thumbs down option on if you would wear something or not. And you get to select all the brands that you already are used to wearing. With this information, there are thousands of passionate, trend-setting stylists will curate a Stitch Fix box for you. They'll send you 5 items that you get to preview before they mail it to you, and you'll get to select based on the image if you like it or not. If not, they'll replace it with something else, and if so, they'll mail it to you absolutely for free. You can try everything on, and you have a few days to send everything back or keep the stuff that you want to keep. Then you can use that $25 credit that I mentioned towards your purchase of those items. Again, to freshen up your wardrobe and also support the Spun Today podcast, go to spuntoday.com/support and click on my affiliate link banner for Stitch Fix and enjoy your $25 credit. Do you want to start your own podcast? Have a great show idea that you want to get out into the masses but don't know quite how to get it from your head out into the world? Well, here's how. Use the podcast host Libsyn. That's who I use to bring the Spun Today podcast to you. And now you can use them the same way. Using the promo code SPUN, S-P-U-N, you can open up your Libsyn account today and get 2 months of free podcast hosting. Here's how it works. Once you record your show, you upload it to your Libsyn account, where you can fill in your episode notes, upload your podcast art, and schedule when you want your episodes to release. Once you do that, Libsyn will take care of the rest. They'll distribute your show to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the other podcatchers that you choose, instantaneously and seamlessly. Again, go to libsyn.com and use the promo code SPUN, S-P-U-N, to get 2 months free. Or use the affiliate link that's in the episode notes. Again, that's libsyn.com, promo code SPUN. Take that great podcast idea from out of your head and put it out into the world. And as always, folks, substitute the mysticism with hard work and start taking steps in the general direction of your dreams. Thanks for listening. I love you, Aiden.
I love you, Daddy.
I love you, Grayson.
I love you, Daddy.